Well, welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and I have Paulina with me today because you had an opportunity to interview a very special lady about a very special book. Tell us about this.
Yes, Constantina Palmer. She is the author of The Scent of Holiness. And when she was a student in Greece, she and her husband traveled to different monasteries, and then she was taking notes, and after a while she realized that those places are, well, first of all, they're underreported. People don't know much about the monasteries and what's going on behind those walls. We do hear about men's monasteries, and especially a very famous one on Mount Athos. So she took some notes, and then people asked her to document it in a book, and she did. And I would encourage anyone who is interested in women's spirituality or in just a very ancient way to worship God, very special way to worship God. The book is The Scent of Holiness, and it's a great book.
All right, let's join Paulina and
Constantina.
Constantina. Let's join their conversation.
Well, a couple of years ago, 60 Minutes did a wonderful documentary on Mount Athos monastic community there. And Greece has been in the news recently about its financial crisis, and like I said, we've heard about the men's monastery there. However, not much had been said and shown about the women's monastery that exists in that Orthodox country. Well, joining us today is Constantina Palmer. She is the author of The Scent of Holiness, a beautiful book about her pilgrimage to Greece and her visits, several visits to different monasteries. So, welcome, Constantina. I'm very glad you're joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us, let's start just, tell us why you became interested in those monastic communities and what prompted you to write this book.
Well, even before I moved to Greece, which was 5.5 years ago, my family and I had visited monasteries here in North America. And so in Greece, I thought since we were there to take the opportunity to visit as many monasteries as I could. And so I started visiting a couple of the women's monasteries that weren't very far from the city I lived in, Thessaloniki. And so I just kind of kept going back. I developed relationships with the sisters, and I really enjoyed it. So after sort of reflecting, after a couple of years of having gone frequently, I started to reflect on all the things that I learned, and I decided to start to write some things down. And in the beginning, I didn't anticipate it becoming a book, but that's how it turned out, and I decided I felt like I had been blessed so much by visiting the monasteries that I felt like I wanted to share those blessings.
What is it about the monasteries that made you want to go back there?
I would say that it's the way that you can really feel the presence of Christ in the midst of a monastery, and in particular the way the nuns themselves act and react, that you see this constant sort of living out of the gospel precepts. And so for me it was, you know, if I wanted to be the best Christian I could be, I wanted to be around the people who lived the gospel as much as possible, so that I could learn to do the same thing. And that's what I found with the sisters, that, you know, the commandments of the gospels, that they would keep them and they would struggle to keep them. And just by being in their presence, these were the things that I began to sort of pick up on and begin to see and begin to try to imitate, though I still have a long way to go.
Now, you visited several monasteries, even though your book is written as if it's taking place in one particular monastery. What, if you could kind of combine and look at the universal qualities that all these places shared, can you just outline a few?
Yeah, there are different types of monasticism. There's only three. It's not like Roman Catholicism where it has different orders. And the monasteries that I went to were Cenobitic monasteries, which is a community that shares all things in common. So they eat, work, and pray together. And the monasteries that I went to, these were all this type. But even when they're different kinds, like there's a Diarrhythmic where people sort of, each individual monastic does his own schedule. But the universal qualities that are in all Orthodox monasticism, really the basis of it is the vows that they take. And an Orthodox monastic takes the vow of chastity, poverty, and obedience. And these are universal qualities that you find no matter where you go within Orthodox monasticism.
Now, with I've been to a men's monastery and I've been to a women's monastery, and I know that there is such like a stereotype out there in the world that all monks do is pray, and some people even accuse them of doing nothing else, and that they're just these lazy people who escape the world, who escape the hard labor and then they hide in these monasteries and do nothing. Now, when I went to a monastery, I found nothing but hardworking men. I mean, was that the case there as well, where you went?
Yeah, absolutely. I've never seen anything like it. And the nuns work nonstop, constantly. So much so that a lot of times men who come to help them say, I can't keep up with them. They work too much. I can't. It's too much for me to be able to keep up with them, because they work long hours and they work hard work. Because they're self-containing, they're self-sort of supporting monastery communities, so they have to work in order to live.
Mm-hmm. Well, can you describe just a day at a monastery? What do they do besides, obviously there is prayer involved? Just walk us through the day.
So depending on the community, they'll get up at a different hour in the day. But generally, they always begin in prayer. So monastics have personal prayer rules that they keep on their own. That, it may vary what it consists of, but they keep that on their own. On top of that, they do regular services together as a community in the church. So a lot of times they'll begin with matins. They'll do the office of hours, evening prayer, compline, and in between these time periods of prayer, they will work. And even while they're working, they're praying the Jesus prayer, different things like that. And then a lot of times they'll eat at least one meal together, a formal meal, which at least in Greece is the noon hour meal. And this meal is accompanied with spiritual reading, and they keep silence until the reading is finished. And it's very formal. It's almost like a church service. And then they'll go back to work, and then they'll have, in the evening, it depends. Some sisters eat, some won't. They do whatever they can according to their strength. Again, they'll go back to the church and have prayer services. And then again in the evening, a lot of times they'll do their prayer rule then, either in the morning or in the evening, in between hours of sleep. That's generally the type of routine that a day would have in a monastery.
So it looks like prayer, obviously prayer is perhaps the most important thing that they do throughout the day. And I found it interesting that your book is divided not in chapters but in 33 knots, right? Can you explain to those who are not familiar with the prayer ropes and what those knots represent?
Right. So Orthodox Christians generally, and particularly monastics, practice an ancient prayer that's founded in the scriptures, this statement, Son of David, have mercy on me. So this prayer is called the Jesus prayer, and it has different variations, but the most common would probably be, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. And so we say this prayer in order to keep our hearts and minds focused on Christ and to pray unceasingly. And in order to help us remember to say the prayer, we often have prayer ropes. And the 33 knot one is this one we usually wear on our wrist. And of course the 33 knots represent, the 33 years that Christ lived on this earth. And so because the stories in the book are independent, I decided to call the chapters knots so that each story that's within the chapter is sort of like a strand of yarn. Together they're a knot, and all together they're the 33 knots that symbolize the prayer rope. And in that way, it also kind of symbolized this prayer of thanksgiving that I had, to God for having given me such blessings from visiting these monasteries.
So the knots, the chapters in the book, you have a compilation of stories, right? Some of them are lessons that you've learned. Some of them are stories from the nuns. Is that correct?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, the nuns, those sisters that you've met and that you've become friends with, tell us about them. I know that you probably don't want to share all, some stories are maybe too personal, but who are these women? Why do they abandon their life and become monastic? Because it's a commitment. It's a different life.
Yeah. Some of them were veterinarians. Some of them were pharmacists. Some had just finished university. A lot of times they'll come before they finish high school. There's even some nuns that I knew who became monastics before even finishing junior high school. And they come, a lot of times they'll come from totally different backgrounds. Some had, grown up very faithful. Others didn't have much to do with the church at all. But in the end, the main thing that they all have in common is that once, at some point in their life, they felt this irresistible desire to become a monastic, to live in the monastery. And they get it at different times. You know, there are some women who are even married, and they decide with their husband to separate and to become monastics. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, the main thing that binds them together that you can see all across the board is this: they weren't able to deny this desire that they had to leave everything behind and to come to the monastery and to live for Christ as much as they possibly could by leaving everything else behind and all the distractions of the world.
Now, it is very biblical. You leave your father and your mother, and so they enter the monastery. Now, can they still see their family? Do they have some ties with their family still?
Yeah, most of the time they're still completely normal with their families. They have no problem. The family comes to visit them. They talk on the telephone. Unfortunately, there's times when the family will reject, and this happens actually quite frequently in Greece, at least in the beginning. A lot of times the parents will be against the child's decision to become a monastic, and they'll not talk to them, or they'll even try to make them leave the monastery. But over time, these things usually get worked out, and the only thing is sometimes if the family refuses to talk to the monastic has the obedience of calling the family and writing the family and keeping in touch so that the family doesn't become embittered towards them.
And then I would assume that the monastery becomes the spiritual family, and the head nun becomes the spiritual mother, right? And then they have spiritual fathers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much like a family, and the sisters are very much like sisters.
All right. Well, the subtitle of your book is Lessons from a Women's Monastery, and I do want to talk about the lessons that you've learned. So after the break, we'll talk about that. One last question before we go into the break. Did you find that the women's spirituality differs from that of men, or because you've probably, you've visited different monasteries, but you chose to write about the women's. So is there a difference?
I wouldn't say that the spirituality itself is different. There is no male or female in Christ, but definitely the approach, I would say, is different. So, men are a little bit more austere, and women are a little bit more subtle in their approach to holiness and to asceticism and things like that. And Abbess had once said to me, men try to cut the rope with an axe in one blow, and women slowly work away at severing it. And I think that that is a really good description of the difference between how nuns go about the spiritual life and how men do it. It's subtle. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's the same spirituality. It's the same Christ they are struggling to acquire.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about the lessons that you learned. We'll be right back. Hi, I'm Paulina, and I work at theDove TV. Did you know that when you support theDove TV, you have a profound impact, not only in our community, but around the world? It's your continued support that takes the inspiration and hope in the programs we produce and makes them available to the thousands of people who are watching these videos online every week. Help bring encouragement and hope to our valley and beyond by making a secure online donation today at our website, thedove.us. Welcome back. Today we're talking to Constantina Palmer, the author of The Scent of Holiness. It's a beautiful book, collection of stories about women's monasteries in Greece. And Constantina went there for several years, studied at the university, and then compiled different stories, and here we have it, this book. Constantina, we've talked about spirituality and the life at a monastery. Now I want to go to the lessons that you learned. And I want to start with the first one. There was the story that you mentioned in your book, how the nuns received an order of black jackets. Can you tell that story and the lesson that came from that?
Sure. So it was the first time I had visited the monastery, this particular monastery, and the sisters had ordered a bunch of jackets for all the nuns in the sisterhood. And when they took them out, they saw that all the sizes were wrong, and one of the smallest nuns came out and she tried on one of the jackets and it was still too small. And immediately I felt horrible. These jackets, I think, had been sent from America, and it was this great distance, and I felt really bad for them because they were going to have to send them back. And the nuns just laughed about it. To them, it was like no big deal. They just shrugged and went back to work. And I remember making a very big impact on me because nobody got upset. Nobody blamed anybody else. it was just for them, okay, it was an inconvenience at the most, and that was all. And that was very impressive to me, that they could deal with such, to me, what would be a very big inconvenience, and they dealt with it with such grace.
You know, you mentioned laughter, and that was the revelation I had with the nuns or the monks I had met, that they're not this boring, closed people. They're very joyful. They're very lively. They have a great sense of humor usually. And from what I hear and from what I read, that this was your experience as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How's that helped them in their daily struggle?
Yeah, it absolutely helps them in their daily struggle, because it isn't always easy at the monastery, and it isn't always, you know, every day isn't a bright day that has no problems. There's lots of problems that come up. And so the humor that the sisters and the fathers have is very good and helpful to help the environment feel lighter. But it's not crass, it's nothing inappropriate. It's very much like a child who takes joy in simple things and takes delight in sort of funny, simpler things. Nothing that's harmful or even degrading to somebody else. They tease each other, but in a very loving way. And this all helps with the environment of the monastery. A lot of times people have the impression that, even in St. Gregory Palamas's time, I remember they would say, oh, if you go to see monks, you'll see that they're just bent over looking at their navel, meaning that they're bent down praying. But the monastics really exhibit the joy of Christ, because ultimately, if we really are keeping the commandments of Christ, and if we really are living for Christ, then even the biggest sorrows in life, they're not sorrows. We're able to exhibit joy in all those moments, and that's really what the monastics are like. They gave up everything and they have nothing. It's like they say in the scriptures, you know, but they possess all things. And you really see that with their joy.
Now, in a monastery, there is a hierarchy, right? Even, you know, they're all called sisters. There is a head nun. Talk a little bit about the obedience and what you have learned about that.
Obedience is a huge thing in Orthodox monasticism, and I learned a lot about obedience there. You know, the sisters practice what we call cutting off their will. So they do complete obedience to the abbess, who's their mother, their spiritual mother. And they also do obedience to one another, and especially a nun will do obedience to an older nun, someone who's older than them. And this is all done in the context of learning how to really live the words, you know, not my will, but thy will be done. Because if we're able to entrust ourselves to our spiritual mother and our spiritual father, then by doing this in a relationship that we can see, we can get better at doing it with God and being obedient to God, and really abandoning our will and doing His will and learning His will. And by doing obedience to our spiritual mother, like the sisters do to the abbess, then it frees them and it allows them to do obedience, complete obedience to the will of God.
You know, we in our daily lives we try to help people, we try to do good works. And when I was reading your book, what really struck me is when you talked about asking for help. I never really thought about the fact that we're so hesitant to ask for help, that for some reason, I don't know if it's pride or what it is, but it's something that you actually learned in the monastery to ask for help, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
What does it do to us when we actually turn to another person and have them do something for us or help us with our tasks?
Well, I would say, first of all, it teaches us humility, because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing that we need to learn, is that I can't be reliant on myself. I need to be reliant on God. And the way that we can learn to be reliant on God is by relying on other people. And why wouldn't we? I mean, why would I think that I could help myself any more than someone else could help me? Because usually we don't see ourselves clearly, and we don't see our situations clearly, because it gets muddled with our emotions, with our opinions, with our will. And when we ask and we employ the help of someone else, especially someone who we respect and someone who exhibits, you know, discernment and prudence, then it's a big help to us, and we're more benefited from it for two reasons: because we're helped by the person who's wiser than us, and because we show God that I put my head down, and I accepted the fact that someone knows better than I do. And all of those things help to build our humility and help us see who we really are.
What is monastics' attitude or mindset towards death? How do they treat that? Because obviously it happens there at the monastery as well.
Yeah, monastics have a very, if it's done properly, if monastics sort of live properly, they have a very healthy relationship to death. Altogether spiritual, but it's very healthy. So they keep what we call memory of death, which is every day you try to keep before you the memory that today I might die, right now I might die. And it isn't in a morbid way by any means. It actually produces in us this very healthy and helpful way to live our lives each day, because we say the way the monastics live is by believing that today may be my last. We believe that today is our only chance to show God that we love Him with our hearts, minds, soul, and strength. It's today is the day that I need to love my neighbor as myself. And so they don't fear death at all, because they know that death is nothing. It's just a transition into eternal life. What they fear is eternal condemnation, because after we die, we either go to a resurrection of life or a resurrection of condemnation. And so monastics only fear the judgment of God, that they fear being put on His left with the goats. They don't fear death itself, and so they live each day with this in mind, that today I may die, and have I kept the commandments of Christ? And when I go to the judgment, what will He say to me, and where will I be placed?
Wow. I just can't imagine. I remember when I went to a monastery, and just leaving that place, you don't even want to talk. You're just so, it penetrates. It's just part of you so much, that atmosphere, that holiness of those places. I can't explain it, but you try to do everything you can, at least for the first few days, not to lose that. What would be your advice to someone who had experienced it, or how can we, let me just rephrase it, how can we keep that holiness in our everyday life?
That was my question too. It was the last question I asked an abbess I visited before I left Greece. It's difficult, but there's so much we can learn from them, and if we go to a monastery with an open mind and with humble thoughts, and we're very careful with judging, then there's a lot that we can observe and we can take in, and then we can just tweak it for our own lives. So we watch monastics pray all the time. Well, we can pray more. We can pray while we work. We can be more willing to lend a hand to a coworker, to a friend, a family member. We can be more careful with our criticism. And these are practical ways that we can keep this holiness that we experience at the monastery, because it's all through our own actions that we're either gonna acquire grace or we're gonna lose it. It's our choice. God is there to give it to us. As my professor would always say, the pill is there for holiness. You just have to be willing to swallow it. So I think it's in practical little steps that we need to employ in order to keep this grace that we experience in the monastery. And then by these little things, then we can build on that spiritual holiness that we perceived from them, that we had in that environment. But also we can learn a lot from parishes, and from just speaking with Orthodox priests, like I think you have a local priest there at St. Innocent's Orthodox Church, and those things also help by bringing those back in, and by being in contexts in which it's not only at the monastery that we see good Christian works, we can also see it in the parish, and those things help very much for us to hold on to that holiness, which all too easily slips away from us because of our sins.
Yeah, well, that's beautifully said. Thank you. I did ask you about some of the lessons that I took away from it, but if you had to maybe sum it all up, or when you think of all the lessons you've learned, which ones or which one really stands out? What can you leave our audience with that maybe will encourage someone to visit a monastery, or to at least learn a little bit about that way of life?
It's hard to say. I learned a lot that I'm still processing, and that I'm still hoping that someday I'll get my act together and put into practice. But I think that I would say the most important thing I learned in the one of the most important things I would want others to observe and to understand is it really is possible to become a saint. And we see this with the monastics. I saw it with the nuns. It's possible for everyday people to become saints, to truly keep the commandments of Christ. That it isn't theoretical. The Gospels aren't theoretical. It's very practical, and we're able to do this by we're able to love our neighbor. We're able to love God with our whole being. We need to struggle to do it, but it's possible. And I saw that with the sisters, that, ordinary people, but completely extraordinary. They've changed themselves so much by opening themselves up to the grace that is given to those who love God. And I think that that's the greatest thing that I learned.
Thank you. Thank you, Constantina. Today we talked to Constantina Palmer, the author of The Scent of Holiness. Beautiful book, Lessons from Orthodox Monasteries in Greece. Constantina, I know you'll be going to Greece soon again, right?
My husband's going back. Okay. I'll be staying actually in Canada.
Right. Well, still pray for us, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Well, fascinating discussion to say the least. Well, coming up, Allan Lee's with us, all the way from Shine TV in New Zealand. I think you're going to enjoy some of his stories. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Dan and I work at theDove TV. You know, compared to Portland, Seattle, and LA, Medford might be considered a small market. But at theDove, we're excited about the opportunity to make a big impact right here in our community. And you help make that happen. Did you know that more than 90% of our income comes from people like you? You can help us now by making a secure online donation at our website, thedove.us, or by phoning 541-776-5368.
Well, really delighted to have in the studio with us today Allan Lee. He's with Shine TV, our colleague over in New Zealand, and he's got an incredible background in broadcasting. We want to talk to him about where Christian media is and what's going, especially how he serves in that capacity there with Shine TV in New Zealand. But before all of that, this guy was in the UK and he trafficked around over there with the BBC?
Yep, BBC.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, how did you get into broadcasting?
I trained as an
engineer. Short story.
Yeah, the short story. I trained as an engineer, and one day I was working in the studio on the other side of the glass there, and the guy who was supposed to come in and do the voiceover didn't turn up.
Oh.
And so I said, look, I'll do it. I'll go in and give you a guide track, and then we can get the real guy in later on. And the client said, oh, actually, I quite like that voice. We'll keep that. And once my boss realised that I was saleable, I found myself doing more and more on that side of the glass, and eventually from there went into radio, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, and how long were you with the BBC?
10 years altogether. I had about 6-7 years with commercial radio, and then I joined BBC television. So.
And in that capacity, you've had quite a variety of experiences of interviewing people. Yeah.
I've been. I guess it's one of the things about working with the BBC is you end up doing all sorts of things. Yeah. And a couple of times I met Princess Diana, Princess of Wales. That was interesting. The second time we were covering the opening of a hospital, and so I was equipped with a radio pack on my back, and so I had the microphone, and we were all doing this live. And as I walked through the door, the new construction of the building cut my radio signal off completely.
With all the metal in there?
Absolutely, nothing there, just coming out. So my colleague who was outside was padding frantically while I was trying to find some way of getting. So every time I saw an open window, I rushed to it and stuck my bottom out of it so that the aerial hung out. So we managed to get through this outside broadcast, but eventually the princess noticed that the man from the BBC, every time he saw a window, rushed to it and hung out of it. Yeah. And she came and she said, I have to ask you what you're doing. Yeah. And I said, my radio pack. And she just knew. So she was good fun.
Was she down to earth?
Very. She surprised me at how normal she was, because one of the things I found was that if you had talked to her, even if you remember the press, and you spoke to her, you were hounded by other members of the press for a couple of days afterwards. Oh wow! Which I found quite intimidating. And I thought,
so the paparazzi going after the paparazzi?
Oh yeah, I know, it's really scary, isn't it?
Yeah.
But she she somehow managed to be quite pleasant with people, and she had that pressure all the time, which was terrifying.
It's pretty. Now, did you cover her death?
I was in New Zealand by the time that happened, but
well, that must have been quite an emotional thing for you after meeting her.
It was, and also I was a strange day because I was actually the duty editor in the radio news service I was working for then, and I was called when the first reports came through, so I went into work early, and I was on when the announcement came through that she had been killed, and then it was just madness after that. It was so busy because, of course, there was a huge amount to do, and I didn't really get a chance to think about it until I got home that night. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning when I finally got home.
Wow.
And my wife was there, and I took one look at her and burst into tears, which, for a news guy is unusual. But I think it was just that huge
the shock.
And I hadn't had a chance to think about it, and suddenly it all happened at once at 4 o'clock in the morning when you're at your lowest anyway. So
well, how did you get into Christian broadcasting? What drew you from the BBC to? I mean, there must be another story in here. I'm not getting it.
I became a Christian when I was a teenager. And I had always been interested in broadcasting, and so the engineering was sort of the start of that. And I had the way it works in Britain is there's no such thing as, or up until recently, there's no such thing as the Dove, because Christian broadcasters are banned, but the secular broadcasters have to do something. So they have to do what they call a God slot. And so I was doing sort of normal programming, but I would do the God slot as well as I was the station's token Christian. It's actually where I met my wife, because she was the station's other token Christian, and so we ended up doing the religious program together. But so I had always had that interest, but I was just working in secular media, and then one day the CEO at RBG, which is the affiliate of the Dove over in New Zealand, poached me. And I found myself working for New Zealand's Rhema and for Shine TV.
All right, so you moved over there, Auckland, and you are our counterpart there with the Shine. In fact, I have to say to our Dove viewing and listening audience, if it wasn't for the relationship that we have with Shine TV, I doubt that we had been on the air when we got on the air. Of course, we reached over and cherry-picked one of your best people.
I've nearly forgiven you for that. Yeah.
Well, we're still asking for absolution for that one. But we brought Michael Brown in, which is, the rest is history there. But that relationship and that collaboration continues. We have shared material back and forth. And but here we are today in this thing called Christian media. And you probably, like me, have watched it go from its beginning stages today, where it's really quite impacting. And it's changed, too. The way we do news, the way we're doing stories, it's really changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think, in some ways, I think we've come of age, because I think when Christian broadcasting started, it was often a bit shaky.
Right.
And really, you had to be quite committed to watch it. But I think now that a lot of the programs that go out, they hold their own against what's coming from the secular media. And I think the fact that I think our approach to news as a Christian broadcaster is slightly different, in that we're not swayed particularly by celebrity and personality. The stories that we tend to concentrate are the ones that are important to people. And I think audiences often recognise, even audiences that have no particular faith background of their own.
Right.
I think they recognise that many Christian broadcasters are the place where you will get the news, and it's truth, and it's honest, and it's balanced, and I think in many ways that's a responsibility that as Christian broadcasters we have.
Well, we have gone from preaching and teaching and interviewing people to where the Christian media services today are full-blown. I mean, the news component to what we do is a big part of what we do. It's a very expensive part of what we do. But on the other hand, it's a service that we provide. Now, if we have a bias, it's because we want to present the biblical worldview. But at the same time, we're not pounding you with negative stuff. We're looking for the way to, everybody understands the world's upside down. What's the answer to it?
I think that's, it always surprises me when I see a story that's being covered, I mean, if we cover a story at home, I watch the way our national networks cover it, and then I watch the way we've covered it, and quite often it will be quite different, because I think often the secular media look for the negative, because that's often, if you look for conflict, that makes good television.
Right.
Whereas we're actually not looking for conflict, we're looking for an answer, which gives you a different look to the whole thing.
Well, that was emphasized this past week, as you know. The late Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher passed away, and I want to get your comments on that. But I purposely came home that night, and I turned on all of the network televisions in America. I wanted to see how they were going to cover this story, and I was amazed about how they didn't cover it. Which was so amazing to me. Yeah. And in one case, one of the networks didn't even get to the story until like after the first break. So there is seemingly not only an agenda, but a bias that we see now on some of the network television. And I think we Christians are saying, wait a minute, what's impacting to a life, and what is the God perspective of that story? So, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I do want to get your comments. Did you ever interview the Prime Minister?
No, I had one of my friends interviewed her and lost.
And lost?
Yes.
What happened? Quickly.
He threw a curveball question at her, and she just shut him down.
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa. Okay. Hey, Allan Lee's with us from Shine TV in New Zealand. We're going to be joined by our own Steve Johnson coming up next year on Focus Today.
Hi, I'm Paula, and I work at theDove TV. Every day we get letters and emails from people who've been encouraged, blessed, and challenged by the programs on theDove TV. But we couldn't do it without you. Did you know that more than 90% of our income comes from people like you? You can help us continue to bring inspiration and hope to our community by making a secure online donation at our website, thedove.us, or call us at 541-776-5368.
Okay, we're back, and we've been joined by our own Steve Johnson, and we're talking to Allan Lee. He's our special guest this week here at theDove TV. He's visiting from Shine TV, our affiliate there in New Zealand. Prior to that, he worked for the BBC. We'll forgive him. But actually, there was a time when I first went to UCB UK in Stoke-on-Trent. On the wall there was the original mission statement of the BBC. Do you remember?
Yes,
do you remember reading it?
I can't quote it, but it was the guy who really was the founding father of the BBC, Lord Reith, came from a very strong Scottish Presbyterian background, and his mantra was, we had to educate, inform, and entertain. And he had a very strong Christian ethic, and in some ways, a lot of what the BBC does. The reputation for honesty and for trying to report it straight.
But the original mission statement, I think the last line said, was to propagate the gospel of Jesus Christ. And, and I have gone online trying to find the original mission statement. It's nowhere to be found.
They've rubbed it out.
Well, we're talking about the how news is presented today, and Steve, you're obviously very involved in it, and tell us what you look for when you go for a story. How do you want to present a story?
Well, I thought it was interesting when Allan was talking about their motivation is to look at not just what is a conflict, but what is the resolution. I think probably not enough of that is done. I think you're looking for just what's the fight about. And I think that's kind of, we haven't really stated it that way, but that's kind of what we are looking for as well in so much of what we do, not just the news, but everything that we talk about, is that there's always a solution if you are a believer in Christ. So it's not like a hopeless situation. I think sometimes you have to get through those conflicts because we're having a lot of that now in the Oregon legislature as well as in Washington, D.C. on some of these different issues and all that. But I think keeping in mind that end result of what it is you're trying to accomplish is, of course, the big focus of that. So I would agree with that. That's
well, we want to inform people, but it's so easy. If you're not careful, you can get caught up in the fight itself, and that's not the role of a news reporter.
But I think
unless you show the fight to be able to show what the outcome will be as a result of that.
Because I think one of the things that people occasionally throw at Christian broadcasters is that it's sanitized news, and that we're not telling the news as it is because we're always looking for soft, happy, fluffy bunny stories.
Okay.
and I don't think that's true. Like Steve says, I think actually the difference is that we are looking for the positive, but that doesn't mean we don't report the negative, but we are looking for as we say, a resolution to the conflict.
One of the other things, you Kiwis, you're an imported Kiwi.
Yeah, I'm an imported Kiwi.
Well, no, you're an imported Brit to Kiwi land, so there we go. When we first got together working with UCB on putting the Dove TV on the air, one of the things that kept coming to the surface as we talked to our colleagues there at the UK, over in Australia, and then in New Zealand was, fine, just don't make another Christian television station. Yeah. What was it about Christian TV you guys didn't like?
I think it was,
I mean, be honest.
Yeah, I think one of the dangers is, and I think the way the world sees us, is that we just basically point a camera at a preacher, and so we don't use television. We're just putting effectively a church service on TV, and that's not really using the medium, and that's not attractive to people. I mean, if the idea of Christian TV is to explain to people what the gospel is about and to explain the good news of Jesus to them, then putting a program that's really dull and boring and set back in the 40s isn't going to interest people. What they're used to watching American Idol. I mean, I watched American Idol last night on TV. Yeah. It's glitzy, it's got fantastic production values, it's entertaining, and then they turn over to a Christian TV channel and there's some bloke rattling on, and you think, well, that's not going to attract anybody. So we have to use the methods of secular TV and make it look good and be entertaining and be engaging in order to share the message of Jesus. And when you look at the way Jesus did things, he told stories because that was the medium of the day. He was the American Idol of Palestine in those days because he connected to people in a way that they understood. And I think that's where Christian television sometimes goes wrong. We don't connect in the way that people today understand. And we say, well, look, that's the way we do it. No, that's not the right answer.
You know, I know, Steve, you can respond to that. I want you to do that because, you know, we spend a lot of time in meetings behind the scenes here of trying to be creative, and we're very concerned about the production value. I mean, we're doing it with a limited budget, but we're trying hard to make sure the production value is at least matching what our competition is. Not other Christian television. Our competition is secular television. You know.
Yeah.
Well, and Allan and I actually were talking about this whole thing of how we can work better as like-minded Christian programmers to be able to say, what is it that we can bring that's new and fresh? The fact that some of these shows that are so engrossing that you'll see on any TV channel happen another place is a little disconcerting. I think we can create that kind of creative programming too that'll attract people to show them what the gospel is about. Now, we've got a lot of great shows like that, but I'll just be looking forward in the future to how we can kind of collaborate to possibly do more of that with what we have, because we've got great resources here. You know, the people that you have on Focus today, and I'm thinking of so many pastors, I won't start their names, mention their names, but because I'll leave out a few, but they're experts in their field of theology as well, so it's not just preaching, but it's why do we believe this? What is the motivation? How can we influence the culture around us? Those are the types of things I think that will really be helpful, especially for our audience, and I'm hoping that we can do more with that with Shine TV.
You know, yes, I think the secular media raises the bar on production value, and we need to be very conscientious of that. But at the same time, it appears that the secular media is also creating an opportunity for Christian broadcasting, because the fatigue factor of the arguing and the bickering and the negative news, people are getting wore out by it. Yeah. And so they'll come to a television, a Christian channel, and say, you know, what's different here?
Yeah, yeah. And we found, sadly, that we were hit by the financial crisis as with everyone else. But for 2 years, we ran a nightly news bulletin. Yeah. And it's interesting, it took about 6 months for people to realise it was there, and suddenly we found people were coming to us and saying, actually, we prefer to watch Shine TV News on top of TVNZ or TV3, who are our two big networks, because it's not got all that bickering and pointless argument. It actually is just telling the stories as they are, balanced.
I know. And Steve, you were conscientious of that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a fascinating thing. What I'm wondering is, when you have, you're in Auckland, of course, the biggest city and all, when you have come and approached some of these people, are you seen as a legitimate news source as some of the other larger networks, or has that been a difficult thing to get through?
We are now. when we first turned up, it was, oh, who are you guys, sort of thing. But we knew we'd made it when we went to a police press conference. It was a major story that was going on. And the cop in charge said, okay, who have we got? TV1, TV3, Sky News, Shine TV, yeah, we're all here. And then we knew we'd made it.
Confirmation.
Well, we're waiting for that one to happen. Well, but you know, it to me, I see news as the great fishnet. If you can do a quality newscast, you know, with all the elements that we're talking about here, that opens the door to receive a bigger audience than just outside those who are very active with their faith. I think people are looking for another alternative to news, and I think we can provide that.
Yeah, and I think it was the Salvation Army used to say, why should the devil have all the good music? Why should the devil have all the good programs?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's a challenge for all of us.
Yeah, and Steve, you spend a lot of time gathering stories, but the way you edit them to me is just remarkable. You know?
Well, I mean, it's just what we do. I mean, Shine TV does that as well. When I was, you know, and that was what, 5 years ago now that I was visiting. Wow, time flies when you're having fun. And it was great to see how they kind of set their, I guess you'd say, set their operation into motion, because that's the way to do it. And you guys were not on a huge, heavy budget either, like so many of the other networks that you're competing against. I mean, when you're in a city of 1 million, the bar is pretty high at that point. And I think you guys had done a great job. In fact, finding out how they did things on a shoestring budget, that kind of relates to what we're doing here as well.
Where do you think news is going? I mean, as far as reporting...
You know, we were talking about that, and we were even discussing the aspect of how, since everybody has a camera everywhere, and we can't afford to hire full-time people in the field at different places. Like, we couldn't have a full-time person in Salem or a full-time person in Portland. The question, and we're asking, we don't have the solution, but the question is, how can we utilize, since there are people with cameras and footage and getting the kinds of stuff that we would like to get, how do we cull that to be able to produce that in our own content? And I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion. So, because we're seeing news conferences being covered now with people with iPhones. You know, all right, the visuals are not necessarily as good, but people are forgiving. If you have it, if you have the comment, you have the person saying what they're saying, then it's undeniable, rather than saying, oh, Governor Kitzhaber said this.
But everything's visual. Everything is visual.
I mean, I think that's it.
I think with the television broadcasting is one thing, but you take these things, iPads, phones, and YouTube's, everything's visual. I mean, it's now it's a video world.
Yeah, and I think that people expect to be able to see it now.
And that's incorporated with radio too.
Yeah.
So, you know, the Dove on our website, we want to see the visuals of the story that we covered.
I've seen you guys first thing in the morning. That's not pretty. I'm not sure we want to see that.
Are you incorporating different thinking in how you're gathering news for what you do there?
Yeah, we've looked at 6 years ago, nearly 7 years ago now, when we first started. We spoke to local churches everywhere and said, look, if you have a guy in your church who does video for the church, then, you know, let us know. 7 years ago, I don't think we were ready for it, but I think now times have changed, and we're finding that people are coming to us and saying, look, I've got pictures of this. We had, for instance, a tornado came through the North Shore of Auckland. We don't get tornadoes very often, so it was big news for us. But we had people contacting us and saying, well, we've got some pictures if they're any use.
Wow.
And I think that's the way it's going to start to go.
As well as telling the stories of people's lives too.
Yeah, and I think that I suspect is why people maybe are more, people would approach us, because they don't think we're going to treat them badly.
Well, Allan, thank you for coming in. Blessings to you. Thank you for what you and Shine TV do to help us here. And hopefully we can reciprocate. And as you do your little travel log to Crater Lake today, put it all on film. So we expect to see it on YouTube in about a week, okay?
Yeah, a week? No, don't take that long. I'm a newsman. It'll be up
the reruns in a week.
Okay. Blessing. Thanks for coming in. We'll see you next time on Focus Today.
Hi, I'm Jim, and I work at the Dove TV. Every weekday between 6 and 8 a.m., our award-winning news and sports team bring you the best morning show around. It's live, it's honest, and it's a whole lot of fun. And you help make it happen. Did you know that more than 90% of our income comes from people like you? You can help us continue to air local programs that share your voice by making a secure online donation at our website, thedove.us.